Hi, I'm Norman Fenton. I've done several videos that expose fundamental statistical flaws in studies which promote the official COVID narrative of a deadly pandemic that was finally controlled by a safe and effective vaccine. Work with colleagues like those listed here and others has especially exposed the statistical tricks used to exaggerate vaccine effectiveness and safety. Now, this includes what we call the cheat trick, which is simply to classify people infected or dying shortly after vaccination as unvaccinated. Now, that trick is guaranteed to produce a high effectiveness score, even for a vaccine that's just a placebo. But no matter how many times we pointed this out, studies continue to be published in the most prestigious medical journals that should never have passed peer review because of these types of flaws. And in the last few days, we've been alerted to some new studies that are especially ludicrous, but which suggests increasing desperation to prop up the official narrative. And I'm going to briefly talk about three of these studies. The first is a paper on vaccine effectiveness published on the 15th of January this year in The Lancet, which is considered to be the most prestigious medical journal of all, but one which in the last 4 years has disgraced itself with its pro-pharma bias. Now, this paper was greeted with the usual pro-vaccine stories in all the mainstream media, with headlines like this: thousands died from COVID in the UK due to being under-vaccinated. But that simply doesn't follow from the study, even if the study wasn't flawed. In fact, the exact wording for the two main conclusions in the study were: rates of under-vaccination against COVID-19 ranged from 32.8% to 49.8% across the 4 UK nations in the summer of 2022, which is both interesting and curious, since it completely blows apart the previous Office for National Statistics claims that there was over 90% adult vaccination at that time. And the next one was: under-vaccination was associated with an elevated risk of severe COVID outcomes. But it's not at all clear what that means, and even a cursory read of the paper reveals some astonishing problems. Now, note first who the authors of the study are. HDR UK is a mainly UK government-funded agency with a vested interest in vaccines. Now, if there were a group of whistleblowers within a government-funded organisation who wanted to subtly tell the world that there's no longer any credible evidence to support the safe and effective narrative about the COVID vaccines, then what they might do is the following: use their privileged access to extensive health data to show that all the previous publicly released ONS vaccination data were wrong. Concoct an obviously flawed study which conflates the genuinely unvaccinated with all those who were vaccinated but not fully up to date and boosted into a category called under-vaccinated, to ludicrously compare their outcomes with the vaccinated. Write the conclusions in such a way that the mainstream media will wrongly be able to claim that those vaccinated are less likely to be hospitalised or die from COVID. Further discredit the results by stating in the data sharing statement in the paper that the data that were used in the study are highly sensitive and are not available publicly. Submit the paper to the most high-profile medical journal that has a known history of publishing bogus research that promotes the benefits of the vaccines. Now, of course, it's also possible that a group who are part of such a government-funded organisation and who still desperately want to convince the world that the vaccines really are safe and effective might also do the things here, because those people aren't too bright, but they're very highly incentivised. Well, whatever the motive, good or bad, that is exactly what the HDR UK authors of this paper have done. And as the Naked Emperor notes in his analysis of the paper on his substack, their hidden data shows that being unvaccinated and not under-vaccinated was associated with a lower hazard ratio for severe 19 outcomes compared with the vaccinated, i.e. exactly the opposite of what the mainstream media was saying. Now, after reporting on that flawed Lancet study, a reader of our Substack alerted us to another recent Lancet paper that we hadn't reviewed on vaccine effectiveness in the elderly in Australia. And that paper concluded with this statement: COVID-19 vaccination is highly effective against COVID-19 mortality among older adults, although effectiveness wanes with time since the last dose. And our findings emphasise the importance of continuing to administer booster doses, particularly to those at highest risk. Now the reader sent us this email where, in response to concerns expressed about the large increase in excess deaths, it was clear that this paper was being cited by state and national senior medical advisors as definitive proof that the COVID vaccine couldn't possibly be a contributing factor to the excess deaths, since the vaccines were leading to decreased mortality in the elderly. Now the reader ended the message saying, I know it must be wrong, but my epidemiology stats is not good enough to dissect the papers. Well, it took just a few minutes looking through the paper to see why it was fundamentally flawed and should never have passed review. First, there's no comparison of never vaccinated against the ever vaccinated. In fact, the authors don't even consider the one dose vaccinated in any of the vaccine efficacy tables. So you see you've got unvaccinated, but then it goes straight, not just missing out the one dose vaccinated, and not just the two dose vaccinated within 8 days of vaccination, but goes straight to dose 2 more than 8 days beyond the second dose. So it's unvaccinated against different classes of vaccinated, where the least vaccinated category is at least 8 days after the second dose. So this is as bad an example as you can get of the efficacy cheap trick that we've reported. Again, the data are not made publicly available, which we now believe should automatically disqualify such papers from publications in journals like The Lancet. Third, the authors are claiming that the unvaccinated were generally healthy because they said that they'd had fewer GP visits and were less likely to have had an influenza vaccine in 2021. Now this is an extremely curious observation, because the most common defence that the COVID vaccine proponents have consistently made when we've exposed inconsistencies in their data is that there's a strong healthy vaccine effect. Well, they're saying exactly the opposite here. And moreover, because of this, because they're saying that the unvaccinated were generally healthier, i.e., let's call it the healthy unvaccinated effect, the authors are applying some very complex adjustments to the results such that they favour the vaccinated. And indeed, another reader summarised the paper very well. He said, it's a bunch of government-adjacent authors, another vast government database we don't get to analyse, a paper that displays lots of figures without any chance for readers to verify them, and a statistical method that's become the standard way to replace thinking. That's what gets you into the Lancet. Now finally, one of our readers, Liz Wilner, alerted us to this study from Brazil, which was published in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases. It compared the primary outcomes of a group of 88 women exposed to COVID during pregnancy and a control group of 88 women not exposed to COVID during pregnancy. Now, the conclusion of the paper was that COVID exposure was associated with neurodevelopmental impairment, and specific guidelines are needed for the follow-up of these high-risk children to mitigate the long-term effects on children's health. Now, that is a pretty scary conclusion, because it seems to show that COVID is even more dangerous a disease than previously assumed. It's like passed on to the children. And there was also, I guess, the implicit assumption here that, again, maybe we need to vaccinate all pregnant women. But in fact, there are only 2 references in the paper to the word vaccinated. The first, it states that all women were unvaccinated on enrolment due to the lack of a national vaccination policy at the time. But in the statement about limitations of the study, it says, as the participants were recruited from 2020 to 2021, the majority were unvaccinated, so the outcomes may vary depending on vaccination status or COVID-19 variant types. The implication here is that maybe only just a very few of the women got vaccinated during pregnancy, so it's no big deal, but it turns out that wasn't the case. Liz Wilner wrote to the lead author asking about the vaccine status of the participants, and this was her rather shocking response. All participants were not vaccinated when they got COVID and or when they enrolled in the study. Around 30% of the participants had the first dose before the birth. Liz wrote back asking if she thought of separating that out in some way and got no further response. And Liz asked, is there a way to look at her work and factor this 30% vaccinated in without knowing which 30% were vaccinated? Sorry for my ignorance, there isn't, and I can't believe she winked this information. Well, that is pretty incredible. The fact that 30% were vaccinated during pregnancy, but the study failed to identify which groups, COVID or the control group they were in is beyond belief, especially as the women were monitored for just about everything. And of course, there is no way of factoring in the impact of vaccination without knowing which participants were vaccinated. Now, my colleague Jessica Rose pointed out that it's known that the kind of neurological issues identified in the study have been associated with the COVID vaccines. Now, of course, there have been continued efforts to promote the COVID vaccine to pregnant women, and the establishment's gone to enormous trouble in covering up any information about the bad outcomes of doing so. So the Brazil study reminded me of the story of the spike in neonatal deaths in Scotland following the vaccine rollout in 2021-2022. Public Health Scotland investigated but ruled out a link to the vaccines without even bothering to identify the vaccine status of the mothers, saying that to do so had the potential to be used to harm vaccine confidence at this critical time. And they also said there was no public health reason to do so. We are clearly in a post-science, post-logic era where we can't trust any data from government or pharma-funded sources or the researchers who use that data to push the official narrative.